Before I get into this episode, I want to start the same way I always will. I acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the First Nations custodians of this land. Across all countries, nations, languages, and songlines, I honor elders past and present, and I acknowledge that this land holds memory, grief, endurance, and truth far older than any of us. This land knows survival, it knows adaptation, it knows what it means to keep going, even when the cost is high. I also want to acknowledge you, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, while you're listening to this. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for giving me a chance. This is Say It Plain. All right. I want to talk about something today that I don't think people realize they're doing until it starts costing them their sense of self. And that's surviving. Not surviving in the dramatic sense, not emergencies, not obvious chaos. I mean the quiet kind, the kind that looks functional, responsible, even admirable from the outside. Because the one thing that I've learned the hard way is that most people aren't actually living their lives. They're actually maintaining them. Think about that for a second. There is a massive difference between being alive and just keeping the machinery of your life running. We spend so much time and energy on the upkeep, maintaining relationships that stopped growing years ago, maintaining a level of stability that feels more like a cage than a foundation, or maintaining an emotional balance where it's just too high and too many lows and you just never get back up, maintaining an identity of self that feels heavy, like you're wearing a woolly coat in the middle of a Penrith summer. And maintenance looks fine, right? It looks like you've got things together. You're coping, you're handling it. You're doing what needs to be done. You pay the bills, you show up to family dinners, you say, I'm good, thank you, when the cashier asks. But internally, it feels like holding your breath. You're waiting for a moment to exhale that never actually comes. And it creates disconnect. And I didn't realize how much of my life was run by survival until I hit a point where nothing was obviously wrong, but I felt completely disconnected from myself. And that's confusing because you start asking yourself, what am I complaining about? Nothing's falling apart. I'm functioning. I'm capable. I put a roof over my head. So why do I feel like a ghost in my own house? For me, it crept up quietly. There wasn't a single moment. It was more like this ongoing sense that I was slightly removed from my own life. I was present, just not fully here or engaged. Like always braced, like when watching a movie of myself instead of being the one in the scene. And the hardest part to admit was I was really good at surviving. I'd built a whole identity around it. I was the one who could handle things, the one who could understand where everyone was coming from, the one who stayed calm when things were tense, the one who didn't need much, the one who didn't rock the boat, so you say. And people love that. They praise it and they say, oh, Cameron is so grounded. Nothing rattles him. They look at your ability to swallow your own needs and they call it strength. But no one asked me what it cost me. And honestly, I didn't ask myself either, because when you're in survival mode, you don't have the luxury of asking, how do I feel? You only have the capacity to ask, how do I get through this? And it's like, it's the architecture of adaptation, really. Survival doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up with a warning label. It develops quietly over time, especially when you grow up in environments where awareness mattered more than what safety did. And I learned early how to read rooms, how to manage emotions, mine and other people's, how to anticipate moves before someone even spoke. You know that feeling when you can hear the way someone closes the front door and you know exactly what kind of night it's going to be? At the time, I didn't know that was survival. It just felt like being responsible. It felt like being tuned in. Later, people called it empathy, intuition, emotional intelligence. And sure, those things can be strengths, but let's be honest about where they came from. They didn't come from a place of peace. They came from a system that required me to be alert. They came from a place where being observant was the only way to stay okay. The body remembers what the mind learned to normalize. And that is something that I keep coming back to because survival doesn't just shape what you do, it shapes who you believe you are. You start carrying beliefs without even realizing it. They become the blueprint for every relationship that you have. Think about these for a minute. See if any of them sound familiar. If I stay quiet, things won't escalate. If I stay understanding, I won't be abandoned. If I don't need too much, I won't be a burden. If I can handle it, I should. And those beliefs don't disappear just because you get older or wiser or more self-aware. They get embedded and they become automatic and they become the settings of your life. It's like the gap between knowing and doing. And this is why insight alone doesn't free you. We live in a world that tells us if we just read enough books or listen to enough podcasts, we'll be fixed. But I could see my patterns clearly long before I could change them. I could name where I stayed too long. I knew exactly where I was over functioning. I knew I was taking responsibility for things that were never mine to carry. I could see the cliff and I could see myself walking toward it. And honestly, that made it worse for a while because once you can see it, you start shaming yourself for not fixing it faster. And you tell yourself you should know better by now. I'm 32. Like, what am I still doing? Why am I still people pleasing? Why am I still afraid to say no? But knowing and being able are not the same thing. Your nervous system doesn't change because you've had a realization. It changes because it experiences safety. And for a long time, staying the same felt safer than change. Even if the same was miserable, even if the same was slowly killing my spirit. It was a misery I knew how to manage. It was a pain that I had a map for. It was the familiar versus unfamiliar. And here's the thing people don't like hearing. Your nervous system prefers familiar pain to unfamiliar freedom. Freedom is terrifying when you've spent your whole life in a bunker. In the bunker, you know where the rations are, you know where the leaks are, you know how to stay low. So people stay. They stay in relationships that drain them until they're just a shell. And they stay in roles that exhaust them because they don't know who they are without the worker title. They stay in family dynamics that keep them small, playing the same role they played when they were 7 years old. They stay in spiritual spaces that silence their questions because the alternative is being alone. And then they judge themselves for not leaving. I stayed quiet in situations where honesty would have caused conflicts. I stayed longer than I should have in dynamics that show off because leaving felt worse than staying. At least staying was predictable. At least I knew what the bad felt like. And I told myself it was loyalty. I wrapped it up in a nice little bow and called it being a good person. I told myself I was being patient, that I was being a bigger person. And sometimes I was, but most of the time I was just scared. And that's the trap of endurance. And at some point I had to face something uncomfortable. I was confusing loyalty with self-abandonment. And that really hit hard because loyalty is a virtue. Loyalty is praised in our culture. It makes you feel like you have integrity. But when loyalty requires you to constantly override yourself, it isn't loyalty anymore. It's harm. Endurance isn't always a virtue. Sometimes it's just a trauma response dressed up as strength. There were moments I felt resentment building, and that scared me because resentment didn't fit the identity I'd built. I was meant to be understanding. I was the grounded one. I was the reasonable one. So instead of listening to that resentment, I explained it away. I rationalized it. I told myself to be more patient, to see it from their side. I did a lot of emotional gymnastics to avoid the truth. But resentment is information. It's not a character flaw. And it's often the sound of a boundary that was never allowed to exist. And it's the part of you that's still alive screaming, hey, this isn't okay. It becomes an identity crisis. And that was a hard lesson for me because identity plays a huge role here. Survival identifiers, they make you feel a sense of self. You start mistaking who you became for who you are. You say things like, I'm just a strong one. I don't really need much. I'm used to it. I can handle it. Those aren't personality traits. They're adaptations. They are tools you picked up because you needed them, but you don't have to hold a hammer when there isn't a nail inside. And here is the part that people struggle with. You are allowed to outgrow the version of you that survived. You don't owe loyalty to an identity that kept you alive if it is now costing you your peace. Outgrowing survival is unsettling. It feels like a betrayal of your past self because you don't immediately know who you are without the role, without being needed, without managing everything. For me, there was a real fear in that. Who am I if I'm not the one holding things together? Who am I if I stop absorbing everyone else's stress? If I'm not the fixer, what am I? That identity gave me purpose, even if it drained me. And letting go of it felt like stepping into nothing. But staying in it felt like slowly disappearing. And it took me to a crossroads. That's the crossroads people reach and don't know how to name. They feel restless, numb, irritable, disconnected. But nothing is wrong enough to justify change. No one is hitting them. They have a job, they have friends. So they stay and they call it maturity. They call it being realistic. But sometimes it's just fear of conflict, fear of loss, fear of being misunderstood by people who like the easy version of you, fear of being seen without the mask. Something that changed the way that I see growth. You don't change when you feel ready. You change when staying the same hurts more than the fear of leaving. That moment doesn't come with clarity or confidence. It doesn't look like a movie scene with an inspiring soundtrack. It comes with exhaustion. It comes with a sadness you can't rationalize away anymore. It comes when you look in the mirror and don't recognize the person looking back. It's the price of boundaries. And that's another thing. I'd like to talk about boundaries because boundaries are where survival identities really get challenged. And if you were taught early that your needs cause problems, boundaries will feel wrong. They'll feel selfish, harsh, even cruel. You'll feel like you're doing something wrong, even when you're doing something necessary. And that doesn't mean you're bad at boundaries. It means your system associates them with danger. It thinks that if you say no, the world will end. I didn't struggle with boundaries because I didn't care. I struggled with boundaries because I didn't know I was allowed to have them. I thought having boundaries made me a difficult person. And my whole survival strategy was based on being easy. And no one tells you this part. Boundaries will cost you relationships that only work because you didn't have them. And that loss hurts. Even when the relationship was unhealthy, even when you know it was necessary to let go. You'll feel the void. You'll miss the person, even if you don't miss the way that they treated you. People will tell you you've changed. They'll tell you you're distant. They'll tell you you're selfish. Sometimes they're right. You did change. You became less available for what harmed you. You became less convenient for them. And that doesn't make you unkind. It makes you honest. And I'm still learning this every single day. I still over-explain when I should just say no. And I still soften boundaries to manage other people's discomfort because I can't stand the thought of someone being upset with me. Yeah, I see it now, and seeing it changes the game. And that's what growth actually looks like. Not perfection, not some Zen state when nothing bothers you, but honesty, the ability to say, I'm doing the thing again, and then choosing something else. And rest. Survivors don't rest easily. Stillness feels unsafe. And when you stop moving, you start feeling. And when you start feeling, all the things you've been maintaining start to catch up with you. So survivors stay busy, they stay productive, they stay helpful. They're always working on themselves and they turn healing into a marathon. But healing isn't another task. Sometimes it's something you allow. And when I finally slowed down, and I mean really slowed down things, then things surfaced I'd avoided for years. Grief I hadn't processed, anger I'd pushed down, regret for the years I spent being small. And I thought I was getting worse. I thought I was failing at getting better. But I realized I wasn't going backwards. I finally had enough safety to feel the truth. Feeling worse doesn't always mean you're failing. Sometimes it means you've stopped numbing. And you have to be willing to be messy for a while. And you have to be willing to not have the answers. This episode isn't about tearing your life apart. It's not about quitting your job tomorrow or cutting everyone off. It's about telling the truth about what's actually running your life. It's about noticing where survival is still in control and gently beginning to renegotiate that relationship. You don't need a perfect plan. You don't need certainty. You don't need to be fearless. You need honesty. Survival kept you alive. It did its job. It got you to this moment. And you can thank that part of you for being so damn resilient. But you don't have to let it drive the car in you. Living asks something different. It asks for vulnerability. It asks for presence. It asks you to show up as you are, not as you need to be to keep everyone else happy. And that shift is messy. It's unglamorous. It's deeply unhuman. As I close this episode, I want to leave you with this. You are not weak for surviving the way you did. You are not broken for still carrying it. And you are not failing because living feels harder than you thought it would. You're transitioning, and transitions are uncomfortable because they ask you to loosen your grip on what once saved you. And if you ever feel called to come on this podcast and say it plain about survival, identity, or the moment you realize something had to change, you are welcome here. Not when you figured it out, not when you're healed, now in the middle of it. So thank you for listening. Thank you for staying present. Be honest with yourself, but be gentle. Let's just say it plain and we'll keep going.